I'm going to close out our episode with this statement, and then you add your 2 cents, and we'll go from there. We're giving you a window, D2.5, and I say 1/2 because Stellantis is actually a French company with 30-something% of their profits coming from the United States. We're giving you a window of opportunity. These decisions that Volkswagen are making, BMW are making, Mercedes are making today, you need to pull these decisions, these tough decisions, and you need to swallow that hard pill right now in order to be competitive in 3, 4, 5 years. I don't believe incremental improvement is going to get you ready for global competition in Latin America and Southeast Asia, in parts of Europe and Africa. And Volkswagen, I feel Hyundai is going to overtake them. I think that's inevitable. It feels inevitable. I feel like BYD is going to overtake them. That feels inevitable. And Wang Chuanfu as much said so, because our goal is to be the number one automaker. So if you believe that this intensity is not going to be exported to other markets, you're completely wrong. And we haven't even talked about the technology companies that are encroaching into the market, into the space, that have wallets orders of magnitude larger than anything even the German government can't write checks that big. Okay, so I'm hoping whoever wants to listen to this, because I do know that there are big D2.5 staff, high level staff that watch this, and so I implore you, as two guys that live in Michigan that want to see everyone succeed. Unfortunately, we're realistic in knowing not everyone will.
Hello, we are here. Tu Lee and myself, Joe White. I write the High Speed Radio Substack. Tu Lee is with Sino Auto Insights. You can find him on Substack too, talking about all things China and beyond. We're here to do an emergency podcast about the crisis at Volkswagen, which is, you'd think of it as emergency as something that happened like overnight, and as we'll get into it, this is absolutely not happening overnight.
Slow burn.
Yeah, it's a slow burn, but the the dumpster is definitely on fire. And before we get into that, a quick reminder that nothing we say, especially about a publicly traded company like Volkswagen, should be taken as investment advice. We're just kind of talking about what's going on from our perspectives on sort of different sides of the issue here, different angles on the issue. So, I mean,
let me frame this. Let me frame this really quickly.
Okay,
because
you frame it. You frame it.
The reason we're having this show today is because I messaged you, and you being the Oracle historian of, let's say,
the old guy,
legacy automotive dumpster fires.
Right. That's been kind of my career. Right.
I wanted to ask you, where does this fit among all the dumpster fire? And I'm talking close to death dumpster fires.
Yeah.
And,
So
that created this reason to do this.
So, and right. And I have an answer for that question. I wrote it, said it and wrote it in my most recent High Speed Rodeo first. And then I've been road testing it on people who have more inside knowledge than I do, or just as much. And I'm comfortable with what I'm about to say. So what is happening at Volkswagen right now is comparable in many ways, not all, but in many ways, to the situation that General Motors found itself in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And some of our listeners may say, well, wait a minute, don't you mean 2008, 2009, when GM went bankrupt? We'll get to that. But I'll try to do this fairly briefly. Volkswagen, I mean, so here's where the parallel works for me. In the late 1980s, General Motors came under assault from Toyota and the other Japanese automakers who were entering the U.S. market in force. They had these great reputations for quality. They had efficient, well-designed cars, and they had, Toyota especially, but Honda as well, had lean production systems, which allowed them to produce vehicles for something like $2,000 a vehicle less on average all in than GM. They could offer more car for the same price and still make money. I mean, again, oversimplifying, but that was the thing. And General Motors management saw this and said, that's a problem. But they did not take the hard decisions, the really hard decisions that would have been necessary to close that cost gap, close the quality gap, close the time to market gap that the advantage that Toyota had. And I'm going to use Toyota, as I almost always do, as a stand-in for Toyota, Honda, the best of the Japanese companies. Nissan at the time was able to do this. They've got their own problems now. In addition, in the late 1980s and early 1990, General Motors was being beaten in key market segments in the United States by Ford. The original Ford Taurus, not the one that people were, joking about as like a stalker car or whatnot. There's some Bill Murray movie where he says, "Why?" He said Taurus. He says, "Why do I have to be in a stalker car?" No. The original Ford Taurus was a significant design break and advance from sort of the square, angular, boxy stuff that GM was selling in the mid-sized car swing. Yeah, and at that time in the 1980s, that car was super popular and viewed as a progressive
we owned one
thing.
My family
yeah, you
owned
one, so you know what I mean, right? Okay, Chrysler had expanded the SUV franchise, taken the Cherokee that they acquired from American Motors and built that into the beginnings of the SUV craze that we know today. Again, beating General Motors to that. They beat General Motors to the minivan, which in the 1980s was a massive segment, not so much anymore, but at that time. So General Motors had lost the plot, but they could not, did not, would not take the decisions to close capacity, cut costs, cut the workforce that they were carrying, that their
How
sales
global
no
were
longer
they at
supported.
that time?
They were very global, and the global part of GM took many more years to kind of go away. But General Motors, at the start of the 1980s, General Motors had survived the sort of the gas crisis of the 1970s far better than any one of the Detroit companies. Now, better than Toyota? No, obviously no, not better than Toyota, but they had survived. They had, by 1980, early 90s, General Motors had a significant presence in the European market, significant presence in the Latin American market, some presence
through
in
like
Asian
Opel
markets.
and stuff like that, right?
Through Opel. In Australia, they had the Holden franchise, and they were significant players in Australia and New Zealand. China was not a thing yet. I forget exactly when China opened, but it wasn't until sort of the
1998.
the late 90s.
Shanghai GM was 98.
Right. And so that was coming later. So General Motors did not have a China franchise at that time, but they were big in almost every other open market in the world. All the major open markets ex-China, they were big. And in the United States, they were the number one volume seller by far, but they had come from 40 to 45% market share in the 1970s and the very early 1980s. And their market share was declining rapidly into the 30s. And that meant factories were going underutilized, started to lose money. Their small and mid-sized car programs were losing billions of dollars every year. And this was covered up by this profits they made on trucks. But this was just a cancer inside GM. Okay, fast forward. In 1990,
Let me.
Well, no, you got to let me finish. You got to let me finish.
Okay.
It won't make any sense until I finish, but I'll get there. In 1990, General Motors signs a contract with the UAW that says, "Don't worry, guys and women, we will not lay off and we will not lay you off. We will not close factories. We will have a jobs bank where if you lose your work because sales aren't there, we'll pay you. Fixed labor costs at a high level." Then Iraq invades Kuwait. We go to war with Iraq for the first time in the modern era. The economy goes tilt. By the end of 1991, General Motors is where Volkswagen is today. General Motors and the then new CEO are looking at a situation where they're losing billions of dollars. And in December of 1991, they said, "Okay, we understand about the union contracts and all this stuff, but we've got to close 21 factories of one kind or another in North America, and we've got to cut 74,000 jobs." And because we've got to stop the bleeding. General Motors almost went bankrupt then. They didn't. They pulled it out of the fire.
Who's the
cut
CEOs? Who are the leaders at that time?
Bob Stempel. He had taken over from Roger Smith. Roger Smith, complex man, brilliant in many ways, completely blind to what was happening or unwilling to face
of
reality.
Roger and Me fame, correct?
Of Roger and Me fame. Bob Stempel inherited from Roger Smith the GM that had lost sales, lost market power, lost pricing power, but had not reckoned with that in terms of the structure and the cost levels of the company. That became Bob Stempel's poison chalice, and he wound up in the position that somewhat analogous to the position that Oliver Bloom of Volkswagen is today, where he has to try to ram through a brutal cost cutting and restructuring with no support from his union, or from the unions, or the major union, skepticism from other members of the board, and a market that's not going to give him any slack. So that's, I mean, and the scale of GM's collapse at that time. I mean, GM was by far the biggest automaker in the world, but they were rotten at the core, and they were uncompetitive at the core. And they finally had to deal with it. And the size and the scope and the scale of it, very similar to what Volkswagen is looking at today. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I had a long speech there, but that's it.
No, I think, let me create some context as a kid growing up in Pontiac, Michigan during this time. Across the street from where I grew up was CPC headquarters, which is now Powertrain headquarters. And down the road from where I lived was the Fiero plant. Mm-hmm. And around the corner from where I lived was the foundry in Pontiac that my dad worked at. And my sisters worked at CPC across the street from where we grew up. So, and I remember my sister buying a Pontiac Le Mans. I remember all the Fieros. I remember the Fiero plant closing. My friends' dads who worked at the shop in Fiero losing their jobs. My dad, the foundry closed. He got thrown into that job bank. And God bless the UAW for negotiating that contract, because you know this, but maybe some of the audience do not. I am the youngest of 8. At that time, we had only been in the United States 10, 12, 15 years. My dad was the breadwinner, and we were all in school. And he used to be in the Air Force, so he could have gone and worked at one of the airlines, commercial airlines at that time, TWA, Delta, whatever. But because there were so many kids at home, he didn't want to leave for a week at a time, week and a half at a time. And hence he became a blue collar UAW worker for General Motors. 28 years. He's passed away, but 28 years with GM. So I know this personally. I know how it affects you. My dad, for 20 years of his life, adult life, he was in the Air Force. He had meaning. He had something to do, something to dedicate his professional life to. Mm-hmm. And then he gets laid off. And he was 40 years old when he came to the United States, barely spoke English. And so GM created this opportunity, which I'm always, always grateful for. The United States, the state of Michigan, the automotive industry. And so I wouldn't be here today without the automotive space. But when he got laid off, he got thrown in the job bank, and for 2.5 years, I think, and I could be wrong, you probably have the exact data, I think it was like 80% of what his salary was.
Yeah,
and
that's
he
about
was
right.
He was a skilled trade. So we had health benefits and we had salary, but he was at home and he did these odds and ends jobs. But if you took another job, you would be fired and taken out of the job bank. And so 2.5 years, 2 years later, fast forward 2 years, a job opens up for him. It's in Indiana at the Allison transmission plant. He's not going to move 10 people to Indiana because we have our lives. My brothers are a little bit older. They're in college, just starting working and stuff. So they're helping out around the home, like financially, when they can, however they can. So what he did, and he bought a Pontiac Bonneville, and within a year, it had tens of thousands of miles, because he would drive Sunday night to Indianapolis every Sunday night, drive home right after work on Friday afternoon. And he did that for, I want to say 2 years before he got a transfer back to Pontiac.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I experienced that as a kid, young teenager. And it was a tough time. I know that, and I'm younger, but now that I can reflect on it, I know it weighed on his psyche because
Oh,
he
sure.
felt that he couldn't contribute to the family, So
Well, and that's. I mean, I think that's the challenge. And let's move forward to Volkswagen just for a second. But that is the challenge, and even amplified, that Volkswagen faces, because Volkswagen. I mean, many of our listeners understand this, but let's just say it for emphasis. In Germany, Volkswagen's role in German society and in the German economy is to create solid, good paying middle class, or if you're an executive, upper middle class or upper class jobs. It's a jobs machine. That's how it was begun. That's what it has always been. They have a 20 ownership stake from the state of Lower Saxony, essentially the government or a government. It's part of the German government. It's a state, but it's like Michigan owning 20% of GM. Okay. 50% of the board of directors is made up of labor representatives, and their motives and their imperatives are the same as the UAW imperatives, which is to look out for the well-being and livelihoods of people, the German equivalents of your dad, right? And that's their job, that's their role. And so Volkswagen is really, I mean, even more so than GM, but certainly, not less than GM, Volkswagen is really caught in a vice amongst it, or in a bind amongst its stakeholders, right? They the competitive environment, and I want you to come to this in a second, but the competitive environment that they face because of the Chinese competition, especially competition again that they face in China, but also in Europe and in Latin America, that competitive pressure is enormous, and it's transformational, right? You can't just keep doing what you're doing. But
let
then when they go home, they can't say to again, the German equivalent of your father who's put in 20, 30 years, sorry, the promises we made and the commitments we made and the role that we've always played in this society, we're not going to do that anymore because, China. And that's the bind. But talk a little bit about, we'll talk
and
some more about this,
let's
the China
assume
challenges.
that management wholeheartedly wants to provide that safety
If they
blanket
could,
for Germany.
absolutely. If they could.
Like let's be clear on that. I don't think we're not trying to say there's bad actors doing these things.
No,
What
no.
I do want to ask before we move on to kind of like unpacking today, Volkswagen, fast forward to 15 years ago, because you had mentioned GM was around 40-ish% market share in the late
Mhm.
60s, early 70s, and they got to
Even
20
into the
something
80s.
in the 80s. So now they're less than 20%, 17,
Right.
16% market share in the United States. So they've fallen mightily over that period of time, 50 years,
Absolutely.
40 years. So can we first talk about your coverage of Dieselgate or your understanding of that? How was that an existential threat to Volkswagen at that time? Did you feel it was when you were covering it?
Yes.
And then let's compare that to what's happening today. Because last week, the board meeting, you and I had that show, and we did talk about Volkswagen, but I wanted to deep dive even further to figure
Yeah.
out, is this survival mode or is this just another major restructuring that needs to happen and
Yeah. It's
Volkswagen Group just gets smaller?
it's both. Let's talk about. I'll say a few things about Dieselgate. So Dieselgate, and again, oversimplifying, okay, but Dieselgate, in where for people who don't know, I mean, Volkswagen in the 2000s was under enormous pressure, as all automakers were, to cut their carbon emissions because of concerns about the climate and climate change. And they looked at that. They looked at this pressure and this cost pressure, and they looked at the costs of going electric in sort of the early and mid 2000s. And their management concluded that the thing to do was to double down on diesel technology, which they had developed and honed to a fine edge in the European market, because the European market was heavily diesel. Volkswagen had superior.
It was a virtue. It was a virtue for them.
It was a virtue, and they had highly competitive, highly cost-efficient diesel technology. And they said, okay, fine. What we're going to do is we're going to double down on this technology. We're going to tell the world that this is the way to cut CO2 emissions. You use less petroleum per mile, you get higher mileage, less CO2 per mile. And we're going to tell the world that we can do that while complying with the strictest emissions, particulates and other types of smog-forming emissions, right? The strictest standards that California or the U.S. EPA can devise. That was a lie. They didn't know how to do that. What they did was they rigged their cars using software, the software-defined vehicle, if you will.
The defeat system.
The defeat system. They used software to when the car would know when it was on a government test cycle, which is very repetitive and routine and very predictable and it's spec'd out. They know exactly what it looks like. And the car's brain would say, "Oh, I'm on a government test cycle. I'm going to, reduce my NOx emissions. I'm going to, combustion is going to be tuned to hit the target. But when I'm out driving in the real world with my customer behind the wheel and nobody's watching, I'm going to, let it rip, because otherwise the performance will be degraded and all that kind of stuff." Again,
I'm going to cough up all kinds of nasty stuff.
Right. And so they got caught. Okay. It was an independent group. I think.
And let's be clear with that. Let's be clear with this. There were bad actors in that.
There were bad actors, and ultimately, the chain of culpability went right up to the very top. I mean, there,
rightfully so.
Correctly so. I mean, who knew about this went to the top.
They all knew about it.
Once they got caught, billions and billions of dollars in fines and compliance penalties and all kind, just billions and billions of dollars. The company had to come up with billions of dollars to fix the problem, to pay the fines, to fix the products, to warranties, redo calibrations so these vehicles could be used. All this stuff. It was a cataclysm. The way they survived it, in part, but the way they survived it was they had, in the early 2000s, up until relatively recently, they had this terrific China business that was spinning off all kinds of money. They were the number one vehicle seller in China, as we discussed, I think, in our last podcast. They were providing the staff cars for the Chinese Communist Party leadership and all this stuff. It's a terrific business. Now they don't have that business anymore, right? And you can talk to that. That their China business has collapsed. It's down 50% in terms of sales. Profitability is way off. They are behind the curve technologically against the Chinese competition. And not only is it a problem in China, but they also are losing profit margin in Europe because of competition from the Chinese vehicles and also Tesla. Okay, let's not forget Tesla in this. Tesla, and they're scrambling in the European market, also the Latin American market. Final thing, one of the ways in which Volkswagen was going to deal with competition in China was to build their business in the United States from roughly 4% market share to 10. And,
with Scout, with more Audis, with more Porsches, with ID buzzes.
Yeah. And that was going to be, honestly, that was a tall order. That would have been a tall order under the best of circumstances. But when the Trump administration and President Trump are talking about 15% tariffs or maybe 50 because I'm pissed off at the Germans today, or 20 or 30 or who knows what. And if one of your main production sites for North America is in Mexico and the USMCA just got put into the wood chipper, now that strategy is not going to work. So they're in a corner. Volkswagen is in a corner.
So I want to encourage our audience to watch our last episode, so I won't regurgitate too many of the numbers and statistics except for a handful. Number one, at its best in 2019, Volkswagen Group were selling 4.23 million cars. Last year they were at in China, sorry. And that had pushed them to number 2, I think, behind Toyota. So more than 40% of their sales was China in 1 year. And 2019 also happens to be the year COVID happened in China. So I think that's an inflection point. That's very important. Porsche entered the China market in 2001 and up through, I want to say 2021 or 2022, had never had a down quarter in the China market. So champagne's bottles popping in Stuttgart every quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we're
Mm-hmm.
selling more Porsches in China. That's never going to stop. And I got to tell you, one of the reasons I started the consultancy, Joe, was because in Beijing at the time, I was living there. German executives, you could trip over them. There were so many of them. And they lived in these complexes, 5 or 6 complexes in and around downtown Beijing. I happened to live in one of them that was very popular amongst the Germans as well. And so, guess what? Our kids played together. Our kids, went to school together. So these were my friends, and they spoke pretty flippantly about Tesla. They spoke flippantly about BYD up through 2018, 2019. And so that's where I saw the opportunity, because I was like, first of all, you don't understand technology if you're just, and they knew that I'd spent time in Silicon Valley. And of course, you've had your share of discussions and interviews with German executives. Some of them can be very arrogant. Let's say I'm painting a broad brush, but a lot of them come
Mm-hmm.
off as they know better than you. And so I they knew I'd worked at Apple, and they tried to discount how innovative that company was. And so that was one of the ways to do it. I work at Mercedes. What are you talking about? They didn't say that literally, but they said that effectively.
No,
And
absolutely. And I remember that period and those kinds of comments from executives at those companies. And yeah, they for a long time they didn't think Tesla was a big deal. They certainly didn't think the Chinese companies were a big deal. That's for sure. That's right.
well, they laughed at BYD up through 2020, 2021, because when I was living there, stuck there with COVID. And you know, the weirdest thing about what was going on in China during COVID, because here's some color, here's some more color. 2019, end of 2019, COVID starts to happen in China. And then I get back to China March of 2021 or 2020. And I'm there from March 2020 to August of 2022. I don't leave China for that 2.5 years. The reason I left was to move back to the United States, because I didn't know 2.5 months later, 3 months later, Xi Jinping was going to be like, "What COVID? Come on in." So, because November of 2022, they opened the border back up, and
Mm-hmm.
so what I saw was more and more green plates in Beijing, more and
Yeah.
more Chinese companies. I got to see NIO, I got to see XPeng, I got to see Li Auto. And the narrative about just throw money at a sector and China wins. No, that's not the case. You can throw a bunch of money at a sector and still not come out with champions. It took Tesla
Mm-hmm.
coming to China for this to happen. What's
Yeah.
really, really important to remember is that December 19th, 2019, Job 1, Model 3 rolls off the line in Shanghai. And that's
Mm-hmm.
when you start to see that hockey stick happen.
Yeah.
Tesla created this environment, brought excitement to the sector, brought recognition, and it brought the level of competition up to everyone. So,
Well, and it also developed a supply chain, or helped develop a supply chain. I mean, the more
yeah,
Chinese suppliers
they're
began.
over 90% local. The
Yeah.
Tesla
So,
is
and
is is sourcing locally.
yeah, there's a great book, and gosh, I'm going to forget both the title and the author, but people will recognize it when I reference it. There's a great book, relatively recent book, about how Apple, you know, going into China
Oh,
helped to
Patrick
build.
McGee is
That's
the
it.
writer.
Thank you, Patrick McGee. Fascinating book. I read it. That Apple going into China helped to develop the battery and the sort of electronics manufacturing, electronics technology sector, or accelerate development of that sector in the Chinese market. And I think Tesla has done something quite similar for electric vehicles, both in terms of being an inspiration, but also in just terms of literally, empowering technology companies in China to learn how to do that technology, with the government, obviously with the government providing a big push. And all of that, to come back to Volkswagen, all of that is now part of what is causing Volkswagen such heartburn. because they didn't respond to that threat in time.
Let
They
me
didn't.
let me throw
Yeah.
out a handful more numbers that we didn't talk about last time. 4.23 to 2.7, 2.6 in 2025 for Volkswagen Group. In between that time frame, BYD went from 460,000 units in 2019 to 3.5 million in China in 2025. Geely went from 1.26 to 2.6. I'm not saying directly that BYD and Geely are the only two that took share from Volkswagen Group, but those numbers, if you add them all up together, that matches that delta, that negative
Right.
delta that
Well,
Volkswagen
and at the same
has.
time, and at the same time, the broader Chinese market, all 20, whatever it is, 25, 23, 25 million vehicles, has gone from low double digit or even less. I mean, I guess if you go back to pre-COVID, low double digit, you know, EV share to half or more than half EV share, correct? I mean, it's more than half EVs, or that market has gone half, is more than half
Yeah,
electric
if you
now.
include plug-in hybrids, it's over 50% take rate right
Okay,
now.
so it's over 50% electric. And so there's Volkswagen. And oh, by the way, it's not just Volkswagen, it's Mercedes, it's BMW, it's the other Western legacy car makers. There they sit with these massive install bases for combustion products, and they don't have sufficient competitive electric vehicles. And so they're losing share in in the part of the market that is also dwindling away. So they're just driving down to a point.
Every negative aspect is amplified in the China market for the Germans. And I'm going to put some words in your mouth. When you say Toyota, you kind of mean the Japanese legacy automakers. When we say Volkswagen Group, you can extrapolate that out generally to
Mm-hmm.
Mercedes and BMW.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, now
Because
you can. That's right.
Volkswagen Group includes Audi and Volkswagen brands. So let's just say the German companies, whenever we say Volkswagen, general terms. And what they've tried to do to stop the bleeding, Joe, is partner really, really quickly with Chinese companies. And in Volkswagen's case, they actually opened the checkbook
Mm-hmm.
and bought 5% share of XPeng. XPeng is in recent quarters has been doing gangbusters in
Yeah,
China.
yeah.
This week, I was supposed to go to Munich, did not go, but they're doing a global launch of one of their vehicles, the MO3, the LO3, the Mona MO3. But anyways,
And let's
so
underscore that they're doing that launch in
in
BMW's
Munich,
hometown. Okay, so like, hi guys.
and you know, I feel this is a little out of scope, but I showed you that the Mercedes CLA, which is effectively the electric version of the C class,
Mm-hmm.
in China is starting at less than 45,000 US dollars. And it's a 300,000 RMB price point, which symbolically for Mercedes, who is always leaned into being this premium automaker,
Mm-hmm.
that's got to be humbling. And BMW
Yeah, and I think you
also
also shared though that out of the box, that car is not selling very well, at least not initially.
no. And I overestimated because I said it's selling in the high hundreds. It's actually 1 month it sold double digits and it's
Yeah.
selling in the low triple digits. And so we point back to the capacity because automotive space is all about capital expenditures, making sure factories are utilization rates at around 80% minimum, 80%
Minimum.
minimum before you make a dollar of profit. Okay. And it's more complicated in China because everyone has a joint venture. Okay. So it is also about labor, but it's also about this partner that you have that maybe does not want to close that factory, especially if it's in their home province. Okay. Maybe they don't care about it as much if it's in a province that isn't where their headquarters is. So for SAIC, anything in Shanghai, they want to protect because they don't want to
Yeah.
lay off Shanghainese people. So
Well, and that's a big. I mean, one of Volkswagen's main partners in China is Shanghai Automotive Industry Corp, which is this state-run government controlled party controlled automaker that also has an alliance with GM. I mean, I think the tough thing for Volkswagen is that, okay, so, you talked about the Chinese problem. I mean, so if you're Volkswagen and you're looking around for where's my lifeboat? Where do I get it? Where can I get a lifeboat that's going to sail me away from this shipwreck, without us, meaning management in this case, having to do terrible things that are going to be that the people in German society aren't going to want us to do. And that's the thing. And again, I mean, back to GM. I mean, they didn't have a lifeboat ultimately. I don't think Volkswagen has one either. And I think that's what Oliver Bloom, the CEO, and Arno Antlitz, who's the CFO,
CFO.
who's been kind of in his job longer than Bloom has been in his job. Bloom ran Porsche, but now he's running the whole group. Antlitz, who I've interviewed several times, he's been there, throughout this whole period. And I mean, I think they are now looking around and saying, our room for maneuver to avoid, painful, cataclysmic restructuring is gone. We can't rely on China. That market, we're not going to get a lifeboat in the Chinese market, partly because of the overcapacity and the competition in that market, partly because they have, continuing my seafaring analogy, they've missed the boat on the technology that Chinese consumers seem to want to buy. And in Europe, the United States, and Latin America, there's no big pot of money waiting to be harvested there. So that over the weekend, and Reuters reported this, I think obviously others probably did as well, but Bluma basically confirmed that he believes they have to shed 100,000 jobs, most of them in Germany, many, not all, but many of them in Germany. He has told their staff, again, this is reporting from Reuters, that's where I got it. There are 4 factories in Germany where they do not have a cost-effective future past 2030. If you're being tough about it, that number is probably more than 4, but it's at least, he's willing to say 4. The question now for Volkswagen, and back to the GM analogy, is, will they be allowed, they being the management, be allowed to do what they believe is necessary to secure long-term survival? Or will the unions and the government shareholders and board members basically say, as they apparently said last week, we're not going to get behind this. We're not, sorry, Mr. Bluma, we're not going to support your restructuring plan. That puts him in an impossible situation as a CEO. Absolutely impossible. He knows what he has to do, or he believes he knows what he has to do. He probably has to do more than he's said, but at least
he needs to do more. He needs to do more,
but at least that much to get the cost base back under control, so that they can have the capital to fix the product and technology problems that I know you've been writing about for years, about their deficits in that area. And my question, is, will Oliver Bluma and the people around him be given license to do what they believe has to be done to stabilize the company's finances? Or does the board basically say, sorry, man, we hear you, but we're not going to support your program? And at which point, he may be out. And he would be one of a series of Volkswagen leaders who have tried to reckon with their problems, their competitive deficits and issues, and run into a brick wall. Herbert Diess, who was predecessor CEO, he was forced out because the labor side said, we hear you talking about, massive restructuring and emulating Tesla and all that stuff. No, we're not going to support that. We're not going to give you our votes. So, it's a real crisis.
The irony of a Diess was, he's 5-6 years ago now, I think. Mm-hmm. And he was saying the right things.
Yeah, sure.
But there's echoes of Jim Farley 3 or 4 years ago saying similar things about Ford. Jim Farley was not thrown onto the chopping block, but the unions did not like what Diess was saying. No. And I think there was a bit of denialism in Germany that it can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. It is that bad.
No, it is that bad. It is that bad. They're not losing money yet. But they have large chunks of their operation that are not competitive, and they know it.
And I want to also emphasize, Joe, I don't remember what that ratio is, but if there's 100,000 Volkswagen jobs that need to go away, there's 2 or 3 other jobs that are associated directly to the automotive space that are also going to get lost at the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 level.
Absolutely.
Supplier, the restaurants that support those communities, the
Yeah.
police, and like everything, the infrastructure, the apparatus that supports that factory, and the suppliers. So this is not a clean 100,000 people are going to lose a job.
It's more than that. And again, I mean, I'm going to, I think I've been talking like an investor, or trying to think and talk like an investor for much of this podcast. Now let's go back to sort of putting on your hat as, as someone who's supposed to care about what happens to people, right? You are absolutely 100% correct. If Volkswagen sheds 100,000 jobs, and this again is Oliver Bloom is, this was in their public statement, Volkswagen's public statement. They want to cut their model count by 50%. So on the one hand, what that tells you is they've got 50% more models than they really know what to do with, and then they can effectively sell
or can market, or feel that they can market effectively.
And whoever let that happen, that's a whole thing, because that's a pretty stunning admission of kind of losing control of your product strategy. Fine. 50%. Well, who makes the badges, the parts, the seat covers, the dashboards, all the stuff that differentiates those? If your job depends on building or producing components for one of those models that's going to get slashed, to your point, what happens? What happens to your community? What happens to? Let's go back to GM just for one beat. We saw this happen in the United States as GM has downsized and shrunk and become, something far less than the dominant, all-encompassing manufacturer that it used to be. Look at the communities that have lost jobs. I mean, these communities in central Indiana where GM used to make all these parts and radios and all kinds of stuff, they've been gutted.
Look at Flint. Look at Flint.
Now, Flint is lucky they still have a heavy-duty truck plant, assembly plant there, which is great, and it's going to provide a good living for a lot of people, but nowhere near as many people as used to work in Flint. It was tens of thousands, and those jobs are gone.
The non-Michiganders don't know this, but it used to be called Buick City.
Yeah, and I don't believe they make any Buicks there anymore, and Flint is a shadow of what it used to be. And Flint was General Motors Wolfsburg. Wolfsburg is Volkswagen's headquarters. It's also their main production center, has been since day one in the 1930s. You go there now and you see there's this vista where you see this building with 4 giant smokestacks pointing up at the sky with a Volkswagen logo on the building. I mean, and nothing says old school legacy manufacturing like that building. And Flint was like that. And Flint has been decimated.
I'd referenced Roger and Me earlier in the show, and this documentary is about all the jobs being shed in Flint and the effects to the people of and the community there. And so, we don't have to dive too deep into this, but what does, if I'm Bloom internally, because we're speculating completely, what does survival look like? What does me coming out of this looking whole or being whole, what does that look like?
That's a great question. And what I would say is smaller and less German. He's talking about, he's basically said, look, I have 4 assembly plants in Germany that this is a paraphrase of statements that he's been, and memos that he's been, that have been attributed to him. I'm not quoting him. But he's basically saying, look, I have 4 plants in Germany at German labor rates and with, the production, the destination for this production that I can't justify. I don't know how to make them work profitably anymore, unless maybe I bring in Chinese designed product and build that in Europe. And that's a whole nother thing. But I think smaller and less German. And how much smaller is the question. 100,000 people, as we've said, is an enormous reduction. 50% less in the way of models is an enormous reduction. I will say this.
Importantly, let me add to that. When you say 50% of model reduction, we don't know which brands that he's talking about.
No, and apparently, by the way, I don't think they know internally at Volkswagen. I mean, he said he in this memo that Reuters reported on, I mean, he said, "Look, we're still developing the plans," and that goes back to the General Motors or parallel in 1991. I mean, they did something that I think no other car company would ever want to do again after having seen how terribly this worked out for GM. They were under such pressure. General Motors was under such pressure from the investor community that they said, "Well, we're going to close a bunch of all these plants, and we have two big vehicle assembly plants, Willow Run and Arlington. Willow Run in Michigan, where they used to build bombers, or the government or I guess Ford and the government built bombers during World War II. It's the arsenal of democracy. And Arlington, Texas. We have these two assembly plants. We don't know which one we're going to close, but we're going to close one of them." And they did a public, competition essentially for, like Survivor.
Game of
Who's going to
Thrones.
survive? Game of Thrones. Absolutely terrible for union relations, public relations. There was no relation that wasn't hurt
And for
by
a
this.
Detroit automaker to pick Arlington to keep open as opposed to Willow Run.
They picked Arlington to keep open, and Arlington now builds Escalades as some of the most profitable vehicles that the company makes.
SUVs,
So that worked out
the
for them.
large
Willow Run
SUVs.
is closed. Point is, I think Volkswagen is in somewhat of a similar bind. They don't actually have a fully formed plan. The leadership is trying to figure out, how do we exit this box, and I do wonder whether one of the next things that's going to happen, and it will be very difficult for the German government to do what I'm about to say, because the EU, and frankly, partly because of Germany, the EU has lots of rules against bailouts and subsidies for companies that are in trouble. But you do wonder if the German government is going to just simply stand by and let
so did the United States, I think.
In
2008.
Well, we had customs that said you don't bail out large companies until we did, right? And we bailed out Chrysler and we bailed out GM, and we're bailing out Intel, today, and so on and so forth. I do wonder whether the German government is going to stand by and do nothing while the company the size of Volkswagen, and as you said, the other companies, the other automakers besides, and all the suppliers face this it is an existential crisis. I mean, they're going to be profoundly different companies when they come out of the other side of this. Does the German government, does the EU just sit on its hands and say, let the market do its worst? That's capitalism, baby. I don't know that that's going to happen. I think that's to be determined. But I would not bet my last dollar that the government of Germany will sit by and let market forces do whatever the heck they want.
Let me add a little more color. These brands that Volkswagen has in China still haven't found a bottom. They're still reporting sales losses. And it's difficult to put together a restructuring plan when you don't know how far the bottom is yet.
That's right.
Some of the things that are happening that create anxiety, uncertainty, management, confusion, Rivian and Volkswagen culture clash in the United States. So, can they work together with external partners? Number one. Number two, they've created this China for China team in Hefei that is now moving faster than the mothership in iterating. Okay. Can they swallow enough pride to say, we're going to do it the way China does it? And that likely means more layoffs. That likely means more reductions in cost savings. And then, the Chinese, we've seen what they're capable of in the China market. Well, guess what? They're exporting and are building more and more outside of China. So guess what, Volkswagen, to your point, they have no pressure release valve because the vehicles that they compete against, a handful, not as many in China, but the successful ones are going to make it out of China and into
the successful ones
Europe.
will make it out. Yeah.
No, so
that's right.
The competition won't be as intense, but it'll be there.
Yeah, I agree, and so there's no real refuge there, and I would say, we can turn head into the last turn here on this, but one thing that I was thinking about when I was writing about this in my Substack yesterday was, if you are a U.S. based auto executive, the Detroit-based CEO, or frankly, even Rivian or Tesla,
you better watch this episode.
Well, right. Yeah, watch watch this episode. We'll be happy to hear what you have to say. But I would also say they are, I don't, this is obvious. They are, I'm sure, watching with keen interest how Volkswagen and BMW and Mercedes navigate the crisis they're in, because they are living, those German companies are living out in live action the alternative reality that the US based companies would be facing if it were not for 100% plus tariffs, government policies that effectively bar Chinese, produced vehicles, or with vehicles with Chinese developed technology from coming onto our roads. I mean, they just tossed Polestar, or appear to have tossed, but we talked about this, Polestar out of the market, or maybe Polestar just left, who knows? But the point is, the United States market is sheltered. European market really is not. And if you're watching Volkswagen now, you're seeing a live action experiment in what it is like to be a legacy Western automaker in a market that is not sheltered. And it ain't pretty. So I do think that, it wouldn't shock me to learn, I have not learned this, but it wouldn't shock me to learn that as people are running around in Washington, D.C. advocating for these bills to keep Chinese automakers out of the United States market, that they point to what's happening in Europe right now with Volkswagen and say, do we want that happening here? And, do another episode about whether free trade is great or not, but I think that is absolutely going to happen. I think that's one of the effects of this politically in the United States. I think Volkswagen becomes, the poster company for what happens when you just let Chinese automakers in and let the market do its magic. It's not pretty.
I'm going to close out our episode with this statement, and then you add your 2 cents, and we'll go from there. We're giving you a window, D2.5, and I say 1/2 because Stellantis is actually a French company with 30-something% of their profits coming from the United States. We're giving you a window of opportunity. These decisions that Volkswagen are making, BMW are making, Mercedes are making today, you need to pull these decisions, these tough decisions, and you need to swallow that hard pill right now in order to be competitive in 3, 4, 5 years. I don't believe incremental improvement is going to get you ready for global competition in Latin America and Southeast Asia, in parts of Europe and Africa. And Volkswagen, I feel Hyundai is going to overtake them. I think that's inevitable. It feels inevitable. I feel like BYD is going to overtake them. That feels inevitable. And Wang Chuanfu as much said so, because our goal is to be the number one automaker. So if you believe that this intensity is not going to be exported to other markets, you're completely wrong. And we haven't even talked about the technology companies that are encroaching into the market, into the space, that have wallets orders of magnitude larger than anything even the German government can't write checks that big. Okay, so I'm hoping whoever wants to listen to this, because I do know that there are big D2.5 staff, high level staff that watch this, and so I implore you, as two guys that live in Michigan that want to see everyone succeed. Unfortunately, we're realistic in knowing not everyone will, but I'll end it on that. Joe, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I couldn't do. I think that's the way to end it. That's the way to end it. We'll see what happens. All right, too.
Hey,
thanks
I
everyone.
know you're taking off, so enjoy your time off, and we'll catch up in a couple of weeks, everyone.
That's right.
Talk to you later.